You were never meant to hear this story, for it was buried not just beneath dirt and stone, but beneath the silence of those who feared what would be revealed. And when the truth finally breaks through the cracks, it does not whisper. It screams like a wound torn open and bleeding through generations. The Follings were a family wrapped in piety and discipline, their house standing as a monument to order and morality. But behind that door, there was another reality, one no neighbor dared to imagine in the eyes of the community. They were saints rescuing abandoned children from chaos. Yet every shadow in their home carried the weight of a secret far too monstrous to remain hidden forever. Imagine a couple who proclaimed themselves shepherds of the lost. 12 children brought into their fold, none of them with birth certificates, none of them truly accounted for in the eyes of the law. It was as if they existed in a parallel world, where paper trails dissolved into smoke, and names could vanish into silence. The Follings created a house where every smile concealed an unspeakable terror. Every prayer was laced with venom, and every bedtime hymn was a ritual binding children to something darker than faith. The first thing you need to understand is this family was not just adopting children. They were manufacturing a system, a hidden laboratory, where innocence was dismantled piece by piece, where every child was stripped of identity, every bond severed, until they were no longer sons and daughters, but clay, molded by Margaret Folling's cruel philosophy. She spoke of redeemable children and vessels, as though she alone had been given divine authority to separate the worthy from the unworthy, and in her mouth, these words were not doctrine, they were a sentence. When the neighbors saw the children, they saw quiet obedience. When the church saw the family, it saw holiness. When the courts occasionally brushed past their names, they saw nothing at all. And that is the most chilling part, not that horror exists, but that it hides in plain sight behind polite smiles and polished shoes, behind Sunday prayers and charity baskets. When the mask cracks and the truth emerges, it does not simply reveal cruelty. It reveals how deep the lie runs through the veins of society. Now listen carefully, because what I am about to tell you is not just a story. It is a descent. Once you begin, you cannot climb back to innocence again, for knowledge has a weight, and the deeper you go, the heavier it presses upon your chest, making it harder to breathe and harder to ever again look at a family, a church, or a smiling neighbor the same way. Step inside their house, and you would first notice the silence. Not the soft, peaceful kind, but the silence that carries weight, like a heavy blanket, suffocating everything beneath it. The laughter of children was absent, and in its place, there was the dull rhythm of chores and whispers, so faint, they barely reached the walls. Margaret Folling's rules were carved into the very air of the house. Obedience was not requested, it was demanded, and every child understood that even a single breath out of rhythm with her command could bring punishment that would echo for days. The absence of birth certificates was not an accident, it was a weapon. It meant these children had no anchor in the world beyond those walls. No paper to prove they had ever existed, no shield to protect them from vanishing. They were ghosts, forced to live as flesh and bone. Every time a teacher, a doctor, or a neighbor might have asked questions, the Follings already had answers, rehearsed and precise. They mastered the art of deception. Their story always bathed in virtue and sacrifice, while in reality it was a theater of shadows where each child's identity was swallowed whole. Margaret had a way of looking at them that stripped away individuality. She saw not faces, but symbols, not voices, but instruments for her philosophy. She called them vessels. Chosen to carry burdens beyond their years, her words carried the poison of authority, the kind that does not scream, but whispers into your ear until you begin to doubt your own thoughts. Children who tried to remember their past, their real names, or their first families were quickly broken down, told those memories were sinful, told they were given a second life and must never look back. The cruelty was never random. It was ritualized. Every rule, every punishment, every act of control had purpose. The home was not a place of nurture. It was an experiment, an invisible stage where the raw material of children was reshaped into something obedient, something hollow. And it worked, because no one outside dared to question too closely. Every neighbor who waved, every priest who blessed their family portrait, every official who signed off on their so-called charitable work was complicit without ever lifting a hand. What you must see is that the danger was not only within the falling house. The danger was the system that allowed such a house to thrive. The silence of institutions that claimed to protect the innocent. The blindness of society that worshipped appearances more than truth. The Follings were not an anomaly. They were a mirror. And when you look too closely at that reflection, you begin to wonder how many other families wore masks so convincing that no one ever saw the darkness burning just beneath. There is a detail most people never consider about the Follings, and it is this. Darkness did not grow in a vacuum. It was carefully cultivated under the watchful gaze of society, a society that demanded appearances above all else. The family portraits they posed for were not just images. They were propaganda pieces, curated lies that traveled through newspapers, church bulletins, and community whispers. Each smile was a mask, each clasped hand a stage prop, each child arranged to form a tableau of purity and devotion. Yet behind those frozen images was a truth so grotesque it could not survive the light. The children learned early that their survival depended on silence and compliance. Margaret Folling instilled in them an instinct that punished speech and rewarded secrecy. The very act of questioning was considered betrayal, and betrayal was unforgivable. Imagine the terror of being a child who remembers a different surname, a different lullaby, a different set of arms that once held you only to be told that memory was evil, that to cling to it was rebellion against God himself. In that moment, the child learns the most dangerous lesson of all, that reality can be rewritten not by truth, but by power. And power is what the Follings craved. Margaret and her husband wrapped themselves in the language of morality. But what they sought was control, absolute and unchallenged. Every meal, every bedtime, every ritual in that house was part of a system designed to erase individuality and replace it with submission. The home became a machine, a factory that pressed the human spirit into uniform shapes. Their goal was not to raise children, but to manufacture obedience. But here lies the deeper truth, one that most would rather not confront. This was not just the madness of a single family. This was the reflection of an age and era that permitted children to be treated as property institutions, turned a blind eye. Neighbors heard the whispers but refused to see the evidence. Clergy praised the Follings for their so-called sacrifice, while ignoring the hollow stares of the children standing right in front of them. The system did not fail. These children. The system created the very conditions that allowed their suffering. When you look at the story of the Follings, you are not only witnessing a tragedy, you are looking into a blueprint of control. This is how authority survives. It hides behind respectability. It cloaks itself in virtue. It convinces the crowd to applaud, while the victims remain unseen. And when you realize this, you begin to see the unsettling truth that the Follings were not an exception. They were an example. They were proof that with enough lies, enough masks, and enough silence, even the darkest crimes can pass for sainthood. The more you descend into the world of the Follings, the more you realize their home was less a dwelling and more a carefully constructed theater. Every wall, every room, every prayer before supper was part of a performance designed to deceive outsiders, while conditioning those within the house. Their rituals were rehearsals, and each child was a reluctant actor forced to play a role, written not for truth, but for survival. Margaret wielded her influence like a weapon. She did not shout. She did not strike with her hands. Her power was subtler and far more suffocating. She mastered the art of psychological control, bending young minds until they believed that pain was love, that silence was safety, that suffering was salvation. Her husband played the quiet accomplice, enforcing order through presence alone. His silence became a language of threat, a reminder that resistance would be punished in ways too heavy for children to endure. Consider the nights in that house, the hush that fell, not because peace reigned, but because fear choked every breath. The children lay in rigid rows, on thin mattresses trained not to cry, not to stir, not to whisper of the lives they once remembered. And yet, in their dreams, fragments returned, names they dared not speak, places they were forbidden to recall. Each fragment was a spark. But sparks were dangerous, and the Follings taught them that fire must be extinguished before it burned. But there is something more sinister here than the cruelty of two guardians. It is the question of how they were able to gather 12 children without birth certificates, without scrutiny, without a single official demanding proof. The answer lies in the cracks of a system that preferred ignorance over intervention. Bureaucracies overwhelmed churches, desperate to praise charity communities, eager to believe in saints rather than confront demons. This was not negligence. This was complicity. By silence and complicity is the soil in which corruption thrives. The Follings became masters not only of children, but of perception. They embodied the perfect mask of self-sacrifice while feeding on the very souls entrusted to their care, to the world. They were a beacon of devotion, but in reality, they were architects of erasure. The children did not merely lose their pasts. They were forced into a future where identity itself was forbidden. The cruelest theft is not of possessions, but of selfhood, and that is what the Follings perfected. They turned children into shadows, and as you hear this, you must realize one thing. The most terrifying monsters are not the ones who hide in darkness, but those who thrive in the open, draped in praise and cloaked in virtue unseen, because no one dares to look too closely. Imagine 12 children with no birth certificates, no records, no traceable names in the eyes of the state. They did not exist. They were ghosts walking in daylight, and the Follings understood the power in that absence. For if you erase a paper trail, you erase accountability. If no one is registered, then no one is missing. And if no one is missing, then no crime can be proven. The Follings exploited a flaw buried deep in the machinery of authority. They hid their cruelty beneath paperwork that was never filed, signatures that were never signed. The children's erasure was not accidental. It was engineered, and the silence of officials became the final seal on this dark covenant. Society itself became their accomplice. Every missing document was not merely an oversight. It was a weapon. It was a shield that made the screams of those children invisible to the law. Think about what that does to the human mind when you know that no one is coming for you, that you could vanish in the night and the world would not ask a single question. You begin to believe you are less than human. You begin to believe your pain is deserved. The children of the Follings were not just controlled, they were annihilated from the inside. Their identities dismantled brick by brick until only obedience remained. And here lies the deeper truth, hidden behind their story. The world does not always need cages or chains to control people. It needs only the silence of others. It needs the machinery of authority to look away. It needs neighbors to whisper blessings instead of questions. And with that silence, entire lives can be erased, entire legacies swallowed without leaving a ripple. The Follings knew this and used it to perfection, while churches praised their devotion, while officials ignored the missing papers, while communities turned away from the unease that lingered at the edges of their home. They built an empire of shadows. They proved that the most effective prison is not constructed of bars, but of silence enforced by fear. So I ask you this: what other stories remain buried under the weight of unfiled papers, forgotten names and erased identities? What other families hide horrors that will never surface, simply because no one demanded to look closer? Because if the Follings could erase 12 children and still be celebrated, how many more walk among us unseen? There is a reason why stories like the Follings are not taught in classrooms, because once you know them, you begin to see the machinery behind society, and that is dangerous knowledge. You begin to notice how easily truth can be erased, how silence can be manufactured, how institutions can sanctify monsters and hide them under the cloak of virtue. And once that curtain is pulled back, you can never unsee it. The Follings were not merely a family. They were a reflection of the larger system that allowed them to thrive. A system that craves order more than justice, that worships reputation more than truth. And that system needs people like the Follings, because they serve as proof that cruelty can be sanctified if it is wrapped in the right language of morality and service and faith. This is why communities bowed to them. This is why the whispers of unease never became shouts of protest. It was easier to believe in the story of their saintliness than to confront the abyss that lingered behind their walls. Because once you admit that a family celebrated as saviors were actually tormentors, you admit that the system that blessed them is corrupt too, and that truth is unbearable for most people. So the children became sacrifices, their pain converted into symbols of virtue, their suffering consumed to fuel the legend of the Follings. Every tear, every scar, every lost breath became part of a narrative that the world wanted to believe, and so the children became ghosts, while the parents became icons, and the cycle was sealed with silence. But you are not here for silence. You are here because part of you already feels that something has been hidden from you. Part of you knows that history is not clean, that darkness lurks beneath the stories we are taught to recite. You feel it in your bones that knowledge has been buried, that truths have been strangled, and that only those willing to descend into the shadows can reclaim them. And that descent is not safe, because once you accept that people like the Follings can exist under the banner of virtue, you begin to suspect that this world is built on illusions, that your trust in institutions is not faith, but conditioning. And when you break that conditioning, you become dangerous, because you no longer see the world as they want you to see it. There comes a moment when the mask of virtue begins to crack, and though the Follings worked tirelessly to polish their reputation, there were fractures in their story. Faint lines of doubt that only the watchful could see. Children with bruises explained away as accidents. Whispers of hunger ignored by neighbors. Cries muffled behind walls that no one dared to question. These were not just accidents. They were the echoes of truth bleeding through the lies. Yet society is designed to protect the powerful, not the powerless. The world turns its gaze away from the victims because acknowledging them would demand accountability, and accountability threatens the entire structure, so people convince themselves that nothing is wrong. They let their own fear cage them. They participate in silence, and by doing so, they become accomplices. This is one of the most chilling aspects of forbidden history. not the acts of cruelty themselves, but the machinery of compliance that allows cruelty to survive. Cruelty requires silence. Cruelty requires conformity. Cruelty requires good people to look away. And when they do, it thrives, hidden in plain sight. The Follings perfected this balance. They played the role of saviors so convincingly that no one dared to look behind the curtain. But those children knew the truth. They carried it in their bodies, in their voices, in the hollow spaces of their lives. They knew that the world applauded their captors while ignoring their pain. They knew that the system worked against them, and not for them, and that knowledge was its own kind of prison. This is the essence of manipulation, not simply controlling people with lies, but shaping the very reality around them until no one even thinks to question it. And the Follings operated within that reality, perfectly unseen, untouchable, worshipped for the very image they fabricated and protected by the blindness of a society that did not want and to know the truth. And this is where the descent deepens. Because if this could happen with the Follings, if children could vanish into silence while their tormentors were celebrated, then how many more stories like this lie buried beneath the surface? How many truths were rewritten? How many victims erased because the system chose order over justice? How many ghosts are standing just behind history's veil, waiting for someone with the courage to look? The deeper you go, the more you realize that the Follings were not an isolated horror. They were a reflection of something older, something woven into the very foundation of human society, the use of family as a shield, the use of children as tools, the use of appearances as weapons. This was not a tragedy that began in one house. It was part of a lineage of corruption, stretching back through generations. When you look closely, you see the pattern repeated in orphanages, run like prisons, in charities that sold children under the guise of salvation, in institutions that preached morality while feeding on the powerless. It is a cycle that feeds on silence and thrives on obedience. The Follings simply fit the mold they wore. The costume and society rewarded them for playing their part well. Think about what that means. Think about how fragile the idea of truth really is. How easily a lie becomes the foundation of belief. Once repeated by enough voices, history itself is not written by the victors, as they say. It is written by those who control the narrative, those who decide what to remember and what to erase. And in the case of the Follings, the narrative was crafted to hide the rot, to present them as saints, while their children faded into shadows. The cruelty of this story is not just in the suffering of those 12 children, but in the way their existence was almost erased. No birth certificates, no official traces, no proof that they had ever been part of the world, except in the memories of a few. And when memory is the only evidence, it becomes fragile. It can be doubted, dismissed, destroyed. And so their reality hung by a thread, one that could have snapped at any moment, leaving nothing but silence behind. This is where you begin to understand that history itself is a battlefield. Every memory, a weapon, every omission, an execution. The Follings may have lived in a small town, but they were part of a much larger machinery, a machinery that knows how to hide its crimes beneath layers of paperwork and polite smiles. And when you see it, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unknow it. The descent has already begun. The true horror begins when you realize that the Follings did not act in isolation. They were not a strange anomaly overlooked by chance. They were actively shielded by a system designed to protect its own. This is where the mask slips, and you see the face of something far larger than one family. Every time a neighbor raised a question, every time a doctor noticed something strange, every time an official saw a missing piece of paperwork, the machinery of silence moved into place. Whispers were dismissed. Records were misplaced, and suspicion was buried under layers of politeness and bureaucracy. The Follings wore the costume of respectability, and that was all the system needed to look away. Ask yourself this: why do institutions always seem so quick to protect those who wear the right mask? Why are ordinary men crushed for the smallest mistakes, while those who cloak themselves in charity and piety and status are left untouched? The answer is unsettling, because the system is not designed to protect truth. It is designed to protect itself, to preserve the illusion that those in charge know what they are doing. The Follings became untouchable because exposing them would expose the cracks in the very structure that allowed them to exist. If you admit that a family could take in 12 children without birth certificates, what else must you admit if you accept that such abuse could hide behind good reputation? What does that say about the fragile scaffolding of morality that holds society together? The system would rather erase the victims than admit its own failures, and so the silence grew deeper, and in that silence the children vanished. Not in one violent explosion, but in a slow erosion of existence. One by one they disappeared from records, from memory, from the story that the world tells itself about itself. The Follings survived because they played their part well, because the system needs them. Imagine being a child who never existed on paper. No certificate, no number, no proof that you were ever born. Your very existence becomes fragile, like smoke that can be wiped away with the stroke of a pen. And that was the fate of the 12 children inside the Folling house. They were alive, they were breathing. They laughed, they cried, but to the outside world they were phantoms. This was not an accident. This was design. Because when a child has no official identity, that child has no protection, no rights, no future. They are not counted in schools, not traced in hospitals, not recognized in courts. They belong to no one but the hands that control them. The Follings understood this, and they used it like a weapon. They crafted a reality where the children's voices did not matter, because on paper those voices never even existed. Think about the power of erasure. We live in a world that convinces us that truth is tied to records, to files, to documents. But what happens when the record keepers are the very gatekeepers of corruption? What happens when an entire life can be erased simply by never being written down? It means the powerful can choose who is real and who is forgotten, and that is the ultimate control. The children's suffering was multiplied by this absence. They could not run because there was nowhere to run to. They could not be found because there was no trace to follow. Even if someone tried to help, there was no trail to prove they were ever there. It is a prison far darker than bars. It is a prison of non-existence. And what does that mean for us? It means that history itself is filled with ghosts, stories, and lives that were buried not by time, but by choice. Entire populations silenced, entire families erased, entire truths buried beneath a world that only writes down what it wants remembered and discards the rest. The children of the Follings were not just victims, they were warnings. Every empire, every institution, every system of power feeds on silence. It is not chaos that sustains them. It is obedience. It is the unspoken agreement that we will not question what we are told. And in the story of the Follings, we see that silence turned into a structure of control. The neighbors may have whispered, but whispers do not break chains. The authorities may have suspected, but suspicion without proof is nothing more than smoke. The truth is that institutions need families like the Follings to exist because they serve as experiments in how much can be hidden in plain sight, how far obedience can be stretched before anyone dares to resist. Ask yourself, why were the missing certificates never investigated? Why was no official record ever demanded? Because acknowledging the absence would have forced the system to admit its weakness. The state would rather look away than admit that its walls of paper and ink could be bypassed so easily. This is the same principle that has allowed governments, religions, and corporations to bury entire truths throughout history. Children taken from their parents in boarding schools and given new names, soldiers declared dead without records, so their families could never claim them, prisoners erased from files, so their suffering vanished into the dark. All of it possible because silence is more valuable to power than justice. The Follings thrived because their horror was convenient. A small example of the larger machinery that tells us what is real and what is not. And we must understand this: the silence was not just neglect. It was complicity. Every unchecked secret, every missing page, every unasked question was a stone laid in the prison wall that trapped those children. And what about now? Do you really believe the same tactics are not still alive today? Look around at the faces erased by bureaucracy, the missing names, the censored voices, the stories. Identity is the most fragile possession a human being can hold. It is more delicate than wealth, more elusive than freedom, more easily stolen than life itself. Because once your identity is rewritten, you no longer exist as who you were. You exist only as what others decide you are. The Follings understood this. Whether by instinct or by design, they stripped 12 children of the single anchor that tied them to the world. Their birth certificates, by erasing their beginning, they erased their truth. Imagine growing up and discovering there was no paper that proved you ever entered this world. Imagine being told you belong to a family, but having no proof that your blood, your lineage, your story were ever real. This is not just neglect, it is annihilation. The world operates on documents, not lives. The system recognizes you because a piece of paper claims you exist without it. You are not a person, you are a shadow. And this is why power fears those who see through the illusion, because it reveals how fragile all of us truly are. Our names, our numbers, our so-called proof are only as strong as the institutions that maintain them. History is filled with stolen identities, soldiers buried under false names, so their families never asked questions. Entire villages erased from maps, so they no longer had claim to their land. Dissidents branded with numbers instead of names, so they could be controlled like livestock. The weaponization of identity has always been the quiet dagger of control. The children of the Follings were not just victims of cruelty, they were test subjects in a silent experiment. What happens when you erase the foundation of existence? Can a child still grow without roots? Can they be controlled more easily when they are no longer bound by bloodline or record, when the past is a blank slate anyone can write upon? Think of how the modern world mirrors this, how databases can delete you. A child without identity grows up like a tree without roots, unstable, hollow, always searching for soil that will never be found. And in that searching comes desperation, confusion, and obedience. Because a child who does not know who they are is far easier to shape into what someone else desires them to be. The Follings did not raise 12 children. They cultivated 12 experiments. Imagine waking each day in a house where questions are swallowed whole, where answers dissolve into silence, where the very ground beneath you feels artificial when a child asks, "Who am I?" and the response is absence. The mind begins to split. One part clings to fantasy, inventing stories to soothe the wound. Another part hardens into distrust, suspecting betrayal everywhere. This fracture is exactly what those in power have always sought, for a broken mind is pliable. History has shown us again and again how orphans with erased pasts become soldiers, how indoctrination thrives when the subject has no anchor to cling to. Cults prey upon the lost, offering them belonging in exchange for obedience. States erase the past of their citizens, rewriting textbooks, so no one remembers what came before. The wound becomes the entry point. The scars left on the Follings children are the same scars carved into entire civilizations. And unrooted people are easier to hurt when memory is erased. Resilience crumbles when continuity is shattered. Manipulation blossoms because without origin, there can be no resistance. Now pause and imagine this applied not to 12 children, but to you. If your history was suddenly erased, if every certificate, record, photograph, and memory tied to your name vanished tonight, who would you be tomorrow? Would your mind break under the silence, or would you fight to claw back your truth? Power is not sustained by strength alone. It is sustained by breaking the mind and remolding it in its image. This is what? Silence is never neutral. It is the loudest weapon of all. When neighbors heard the laughter of 12 children, but never asked why none had birth certificates. They became accomplices through indifference when authorities noted the gaps in paperwork, but filed them away into the abyss. They too became hands holding the knife. Not through action, but through refusal. Every system thrives on silence. The corruption of the Follings home was not sustained by secrecy alone. It was nourished by the willingness of others to look away. Society loves its illusions, and it loves them more than truth. For truth is dangerous. It shatters comfort. It forces accountability. And so when evidence threatens the illusion, it is buried under layers of excuses and distractions. Think about how this same silence echoes through greater history, how regimes have thrived because ordinary men and women obeyed without question, how institutions have covered atrocities with ceremonies, parades, and headlines designed to distract you from the rot beneath the paint. Society becomes a theater where everyone plays their role, pretending not to see the shadow crouching in the corner. The 12 children were trapped not only by the Follings' cruelty, but by a wider net of collective denial, and that is the darkest part of their history, that cruelty on its own cannot thrive without permission from the crowd. Cruelty demands witnesses who refuse to intervene. It demands an audience that covers its ears and pretends nothing is wrong. Now I ask you to step outside of their story and look into your own. How many times have you seen injustice ignored in plain sight? How many times have you watched someone's life crumble while others laughed, scrolled, or turned away? The question is not whether you will see darkness in this world, but whether you will choose to confront it. When it stands before you, society will always tell you to stay. Identity is the most fragile possession of a human being. Strip a person of their name, their origin, their bloodline, and you do not simply erase them. You rewrite them into whatever shape the system desires. That was the genius of the Follings. Taking children without birth certificates meant they could shape their reality like clay. They could dictate their past, their worth, their future. Think about what it means to exist without official recognition. No papers, no record, no anchor to the lineage of ancestors. You are untethered, drifting in a world that does not see you. You are both invisible and imprisoned, for the same institutions that do not acknowledge your birth will still punish your actions in adulthood. That contradiction is not a mistake. It is the design of control. The state has always understood this erasure as a weapon. Empires destroyed tribal records and replaced them with new identities, forced names, religions, and borders on conquered people. Regimes wiped family archives to ensure no one remembered who they once were. It is easier to enslave when the enslaved no longer remember freedom. It is easier to command when the commanded no longer know they have a history worth defending. The Follings were not just caretakers of children, they were engineers of memory. They curated what those children were allowed to believe about themselves. They cut them off from the roots that might have given them strength and replaced it with dependency and fear. This same tactic has been used in boarding schools, designed to destroy indigenous cultures, in orphanages that funneled children into servitude, in systems that pretended to be salvation while operating as prisons. Imagine growing up never knowing where you come from, never seeing the documents that prove you exist. How would you anchor your identity? How would you resist when every authority tells you that you were no one from nowhere? The greatest trick of power is convincing its prisoners that their cage is a sanctuary. Chains are easier to bear when they are disguised, as safety obedience is easier to extract when it masquerades as love, and the Follings perfected this illusion under their roof. Every child they took in was told they were chosen, rescued, saved from a life of wandering. Yet in truth they were stripped of every thread that tied them to freedom. Their shelter was a stage, and the script was written to erase resistance. The children were fed enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. They were clothed to appear respectable, yet always reminded of dependence. They were disciplined not to strengthen character, but to erase will. This same illusion has always been woven into the fabric of civilization. Governments declare laws to protect us, yet those same laws exist to bind us. Economies promise opportunity, while ensuring perpetual servitude. Schools claim to educate, yet often condition minds to repeat, rather than to think. Prisons promise rehabilitation, while constructing industries of profit from human misery at every turn. Power wears the mask of care while sharpening the blade of control. The Follings' children were subjected to a more intimate form of this deception. They were told they were part of a family, yet were denied the very documentation that makes a family visible to the outside world. They were reminded to be grateful even as their rights were erased. They were made to believe they had been given everything even as everything was stolen from them. This is not simply cruelty. It is indoctrination. To strip someone of their history and then present yourself as their savior is the purest form of domination, for the victim will cling to their captor, believing that without them, There is no life, no identity. No hope. This cycle repeats endlessly in institutions both small and vast, from orphanages to... There is a reason why certain families rise and others vanish. A reason why some legacies are celebrated while others are erased. What the Follings did to those 12 children was not only about control in the present, it was about engineering a future, a hidden lineage that belonged to them and them alone. By erasing the children's past, they rewrote destiny itself. Imagine never having a birth certificate, never existing on paper. You become a ghost, yet that ghost can be molded into anything the architects of power desire. You can be sent anywhere, shaped into any role, made to disappear or made to serve. And no system will ever come searching for you, because in the eyes of the state, you never lived. This is how empires perpetuate themselves. They do not merely control the present, they seed the future. The pharaohs buried their secrets in stone bloodlines, hoarded their names in private archives. Monarchs rewrote history to ensure their line appeared chosen by God. The Follings, on a smaller but no less sinister scale, removed the past to dictate the future. 12 blank slates, 12 vessels of obedience, 12 silent inheritances of their will. Do you see how this mirrors the structures around us today? Records can be forged. Databases can vanish. Entire communities can be reclassified, erased, or absorbed without resistance. The same tools of invisibility that enslaved those children are applied on the global stage. Populations, displaced identities, stripped archives, burned, until only the narrative of the victor remains. The children of the Follings became more than orphans. They became symbols of what power always craves: total ownership, not just of your body, not just of your labor, but of your very existence, your story, your bloodline, your tomorrow. And here's the most disturbing truth: once this pattern enters, blood, once generations are forged in secrecy and shadow, it does not simply dye it. The final truth is not about the Follings alone. It is about the part of ourselves that looks away when cruelty hides behind respectability, when suffering is quietly endured, because it is inconvenient to see it or too terrifying to confront. We like to think monsters live in faraway places, in abandoned houses, in the shadows of dense forests. But the Follings prove that evil can occupy a well-manicured lawn, a charity gala, a church pew. It can smile at neighbors and shake hands with authority. And so the lesson is brutally simple. Vigilance is not optional when the vulnerable are at risk. Indifference is complicity. Seeing is not enough. Speaking is not enough. Acting is the only defense, because monsters thrive in the spaces left empty by courage. Every report ignored, every question dismissed, every suspicion silenced creates a lattice of darkness through which cruelty travels unchallenged. And history has shown this again and again, from families like the Follings to institutions that shelter abuse to governments that turn their gaze away. The names of the victims matter because naming is resistance. Maria Tyrell, Alexei Lucia Kwame, Trans Sarah Dimitri, and the unknown. 5, each name a life stolen, each name a signal flare for remembrance and justice. To say we remember is to affirm that what happened cannot happen again, not in that house, not in that town, not anywhere, if we hold to memory and action. And there is another truth that is more intimate, harder to digest. We are all capable of overlooking warning signs of suffering when it touches lives that seem removed from ours. When neighbors notice and look away, when colleagues hesitate to report, when authorities assume the worst without verifying the truth. The machinery of abuse rolls on unnoticed. Each failure compounds the last, and eventually the sum of negligence births horrors that no single person could have imagined, yet everyone shares.